You see, if I'm anti-process as you defined it, it's only because, again, on my own times, being that I'm totally involved in the sound, I don't want anything to interfere with my intention.
In his exposition, Morton Feldman confronts silence intuitively, and I don't speak of Cagean silence as in 4 minutes 33 seconds, but the interval which dominates without being dominant. The subtle recognition that A sharp is not B flat. Morton speaks of Hegel enough to know where he stands on Hegel and Hegelism. It might be helpful for some if we examine who Hegel is. Born in 1770, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was a German philosopher. Some say the most important figure in German idealism. He is considered one of the fundamental figures of modern Western philosophy, with his influence extending to the entire range of contemporary philosophical issues, from aesthetics to ontology to politics, both in the analytic and continental tradition. Hegel's principal achievement was his development of a distinctive articulation of idealism, sometimes termed absolute idealism, in which the dualisms of, for instance, mind and nature and subject and object are overcome. His philosophy of spirit conceptually integrates psychology, the state, history, art, religion, and philosophy. His master-slave dialectic has been influential, especially in 20th century France. Of special importance is his concept of spirit, Geist, sometimes also translated as mind, as the historical manifestation of the logical concept, and the sublation, or seemingly contradictory or opposing factors, examples which include the apparent opposition between necessity and freedom and between immanence and transcendence. Hegel has been seen in the 20th century as the originator of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, triad, but as an explicit phrase it originated with Johann Gottlieb Fichte. Hegel has influenced many thinkers and writers whose own positions vary widely. For example, the roots of post-Structuralism. In his work Systematic Theology, theologian Paul Tillich referred to Hegel's work as perfect essentialism. Later writing, essentialism was in Hegel's system fulfilled. In Morton Feldman's system, or absence of system, serialism is fulfilled. And we are able to confront honestly the silence that emits alongside and betwixt the notes and the strokes of the paintbrush. We must, for all else has failed us. The simplicity of the sound, intuitively created, fills us with something closer than what has gone before, possibly what will follow afterwards. So my piece is more attuned to Feldman's confrontation with silence and resolving the absence which dwells in the spaces between.
Interplay, and I mean this both on the social and on the artistic level.
Yes, you see, the reason my music is limited is because I don't believe in Hegel.
Oh, thank God.
So I'm not looking for another element in which to make my synthesis.
Well, what does this do to, with continuation within a piece? You know, how do you get from the beginning of...
If you don't believe in Hegel,
Well,
how do you
to the end.
write a composition?
Right, yeah.
You know, because the whole business, we believe in Hegel, like the Soviet Union believed in Hegel when they signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. They thought they were going to swallow him up, being that they believed in Hegel. But then they realized that they might be swallowed up.
Since Germany believes in Hegel.
Since Germany believes in Hegel. And it's the same thing when you set up with this multitudinous idea of how you're going to utilize all these things, you know, and eat them up in a gargantuan way in writing a very impressive composition. But if you don't believe in that, then all this other stuff becomes indeed very superficial.
And so when you're sitting down at your drafting table or wherever you write your music, what do you do with the paper? You don't start at the beginning and work through in some Hegelian fashion to an end.
You feel yourself. After all, what is process? Process is how to get the hell out of it. That's process.
Well, of course, the easiest way is simply not to begin. So is there a little bit of Hegel left in everybody who begins?
Yes.
And the difficulty, it seems to me, in choosing not to believe in Hegel is simply the difficulty in getting on with those who still insist on it.
Exactly. If people want my work to be more impressive, they want me to believe in Hegel. That's what it amounts to.
Yeah, yeah. And this, of course, comes into every relationship with a conductor or with a critic and with 9/10 of the audience.
I mean, the most beautiful example, myself at this particular time is not a good example. But I think the most beautiful example is someone like Mondrian. In relation, say, to Picasso.
Well, except that Mondrian is almost in a vagrant position of being very ambiguous, and it would be easy for me to believe that he had a very Hegelian attitude toward filling up his canvas. There's such carefully, or it seems, carefully worked out balance, construction, etc., etc.
It's not worked out, it's felt out.
Oh, then it comes down to a question of intuitive as opposed to knowledgeable Hegelianism.
Well, the great bit about, say, someone like Picasso, and then we could tie it up with Schoenberg, because if we think, say, for example, it's Cubism related. In other words, with what ingenuity can you dissect the rectangle, you see, in relation to what ingenuity can you dissect the scale, or the rosette, you see, then where does someone like Mondrian come into the picture? Where the ingenuity is an intuitive process.
Well, now, where you are discounting a Hegelian behavior, all right, I'm getting back to the question of what are you doing at the drafting table. It's easy for me to understand how you compose a piece of music, but it's less easy for me to understand how you compose either a long piece of music or a second piece of music. It seems now, for example, does a long piece require some kind of a formal or structural consideration?
No.
It simply requires that more time pass.
No, I think it requires a sense of scale.
A balance.
No, just the scale, which could be a very intuitive thing. I mean, there's one thing of saying I'm going to work on a 10 by 10 canvas, and another thing, and then trying to fill it up, and another thing, finding that it's becoming a 10 by 10 canvas.
Because something was too big in the first place for its original size.
Yes.
And this happens then also in music.
Yes, in other words, I don't say I'm going to write. I never say to myself, I'm going to write an orchestral piece. I never say to myself that I'm going to write a piece.
Sounds
But
big.
I'm shrewd enough always to start with 20-line paper, you see. So I can catch anything in the net that's happening. And then little by little, you know, we're not that brilliant. We always want to tie things together. We always want to make a package. As soon as you finally settle on an instrumentation, you have a more realistic structure.
And then comes the moment when you realize you absolutely must have an alto flute, in addition to the instrumentation that you'd already decided upon.
Yes, then you really begin to hear things.
As soon as you rule out a possibility.
So my assumption, and has always been my assumption, is that this need for organizational principle is an intuitive one, which is so strong to begin with. Why burden it with the other? I don't think we have the talent to be, and I don't even think that's advisable that it should be such. I don't think we have the talent to sit down and say, I'm going to write a piece that throughout eternity will never have a sense of organization. Because just the materials that I begin to use will tie it up in the mind and in the ear.
Or just the fact that you and only you worked on it.
Exactly. Is the omnipotent organizational process behind the tree, you see.
A couple of years ago, or maybe 1 year ago, Christian Wolff came out here and did a concert together with Robert Moran. And on the program was a composition called The Possibility of a New Composition for Electric Guitar by Morton Feldman. And I was very much charmed by the music. And I said, you know, we recorded the concert, and I said, gee, I'm really happy that the performance went so well because it's a nice piece and we have a tape of it. And Wolf said, well, I don't think that Feldman's finished with the piece. I think that, you know, there are going to be some changes in it, so you better not do anything about it until we find out. And we've never found out. Have you ever found out?
No, I never found out.
Maybe it would help if you could hear the tape.
A Christian came to me and he asked for this piece, and first Christian called me. He lives in Cambridge, he doesn't live in New York. You know, he's a professor of classics at Harvard.
That's right, yeah, I remember.
That's how it sounds, like the economic bit.
Yeah. People are getting out of trying to make a living out of music. They're going some other way.
I'm trying to make a living out of music. As I told you, I'm now going to...
You're turning into the enfant terrible of this whole...
I want to make a living out of music.
You think of total serialization?
I think of total serialization. Total serialization without a grid.
Oh, well, that's a different matter altogether.
Who was it that could draw a cycle, a perfect cycle freehand? Who was it? Was it Giotto?
I can't imagine it.
Yes. Who was it? I'll find out this
It was
afternoon.
probably somebody who lived in the days before they had compasses.
Well, that's my dream. In other words, in relation to... I want to do total serialization freehand.
You mean to compose a piece of music which only upon analysis somebody would prove to you that it was totally serialized?
That's right. I'm only half joking, you understand?
Well, this is not so terribly surprising to anyone who's familiar with your durations and your projections, which are chance pieces. Now, this is very interesting because Boulez has been quoted as saying it's not how something sounds that's important, but how it's made. And you've been quoted as arguing greatly with this.
Yes.
In other words, you want how it's made to be kept a private matter.
Yes, totally.
And how it sounds should be as public as possible, of course.
Only.
Well, then, is this a part of the hang-up with the possibility of a new composition for electric guitar?
Oh, no. But getting back to that story, no, it was just a little in thing. The title of the piece just came from a letter that I wrote back to Christian, telling him that, well, there's a possibility of a new piece for electric guitar.
Well, there actually was a new piece for electric guitar, as it turned out.
It wasn't,
It was heard, you know, by a good many people. Was it written?
yes, it was written, but he's the only one who has the score. I didn't give it to my publisher, and I don't even have a copy. There's still a possibility that I might write a piece someday for electric guitar.
It's a very fine instrument.
I'm going to like it more and more.
I think it's the vibraphone of the future. Well, that was going to be the next question.
You know, it's always very interesting about music. I think that throughout history, it's only going to have a great past, never a future.
Well, it doesn't even always have a present. At least these days it seems to have a present of some sort.
Because, you know, like a kid, I remember in New York subways, it was always great to stand at the end of the train and watch getting in the station at the last moment by looking backwards.
Yeah.
And to me, that's what music is. There's something about music that is not visionary. As much as people might talk about the music of the future, there's just something about music that only seems to come out of looking backward.
So it'll always be simply a collection of historical necessities.
Exactly.
Well, now this, you know, young composers these days are in a terrible situation because, and I know this is said all the time, but it really seems truer now than at any point in the past. Pretty much everything's been done. The boundaries have been found, not erected, but really sort of discovered. I mean, with the minute you've got 4 minutes and 33 seconds, that takes care of one boundary, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
And so now there seems to be only a possibility of at least when it comes to styles, an eclecticism.
But it was always like that. I mean, Stravinsky paved the way between joining his neoclassic mode with 12-tone elements, the eclecticism of various serial composers incorporating chants. Consolidation, that's music.
Well, that's what composition means. In
That wasn't, yes, that wasn't necessarily, you see, it's not my hang-up. My secret is that at a very early life, I became very friendly with a group of painters who were terrific painters. I was caught between two disciplines. And when I would think about music, I would say, why is it you get involved in process and the musician is always an academician? And why is it that the painter gets involved in process and he becomes a Cézanne?
Well, this is, when you're talking about process here, you're talking about compositional procedures,
Yes.
not about process in the Cage Tudor sense of the word, where the process is the composition. You're talking about the process as distinct from composition. It seems to me a differentiation that's really necessary to maintain.
Yes.
In other words, what you're concerned with, then, I would guess, is that the composer simply allow his music to exist and to examine itself and its surroundings.
Yes.
Halfway, objectively, and detachedly, but without a sort of analytical preoccupation in mind. In other words, maintain a procedure which is un-Hegelian. It seems to come back to that.
Yes.
Un-teleological. The idea of a piece of music in which one can wander. Certain places in Mahler, most places in Webern. I think all of your music, all of Cage's music, most of Wolf's music. This is what you wind up with, the sort of garden of sounds.
Yes.
With no path, no paved path, which it's necessary to follow.
I wouldn't say that, at least for myself. I would still say that my mind, my instinct is his path. I don't want anything to interfere with my intention. At the same time, how can I present my work without an intention?
Well, it seems to me that this is a restatement of a remark that you made earlier, that there is no future, that the whole thing will be a collection of backward vistas, not only in the large picture of music as a whole, as a tradition, but in the small picture of a composer at work on each composition, or an audience at work on each performance.
Yes.
And even of the connection possibly between the composer and the performer, which is another matter.
Yes. Also, I don't think about art as a kind of living thing. I think about art really as a dead thing that you look back at.
Rather than as a live process in which you become involved.
Yes. I mean, what's the point? It's a very interesting thing, I mean, to talk about performances that you heard, and then you hear what happens to it after 15 or 20 years. Or to walk into an old Franz Klein show in 1950 and then just see individual Kleins in various museums, you know. That initial experience drops dead. Nothing keeps it alive.
Except that it becomes another piece of art.
Yes. In that sense, the Cagean idea. But it's not a kind of simultaneous division. That division takes place in big time gaps. The difference between the work, its performance, and the audience.
Well, we seem to have come full circle, and I can't really think of any reason to add to it. You maintain a complete sense of detachment.
Well,
I mean, to art,
you
to
see,
works of art.
yes, well, getting back what interests me about Milton Babbitt, in a sense, is that I do admire things that are only what they are. that sense, I do admire him. Just as I would admire Racine with all its rhetoric, because it's obviously,
That's a part of it.
it is what it is.
Yeah.
You see.
Well, then it's very difficult not to admire anything.
No, it is, well, you know, it's like camp when Susan Sontag would talk about, say, a de Gaulle speech as being camp. Only means is that you have to be very shrewd in your assessment what type of rhetoric is authentic.
This is a subject for another discussion someday, because now we're getting into, well, something that could be called instructions to a young critic, or to a young historian.
Well, I mean, you listen to a piece and you say, oh, gee, that's overblown stuff.
Yeah.
You listen to another piece that's overblown, you don't say it's overblown stuff. What's the difference?
Simply what you bring to your decision.
You're looking at a kind of minimal art and you say, well, this is certainly minimal art. And you look at another minimal art and you say, well, this certainly has an aura about it. What's the difference?
Well, do you think that difference will ever be defined? I've never heard it defined.
Well, that's what separates the boys from the Boy Scouts.